right. All right, folks, welcome to another episode of Going South. I am very, very fortunate to have Dr. Johanna Fernández with me today. She is a history professor at Baruch College, which is a part of the City University system of New York. In 2020, she authored The Young Lords, a radical history that talks about political activism in both Chicago and New York by Puerto Rican folks that worked with the Black Panthers and kind of modeled some of their work. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. She also filed a FOIL lawsuit against the New York Police Department in order to get a number of files, I think initially for her research, but she's going to talk about what came out of that struggle. The NYPD was not very cooperative in terms of giving her that information, but as a result, just thousands upon thousands of kind of documents came out that dealt with how the New York Police Department surveilled a variety of social movements and activists between 1954 and 1972, including Malcolm X. She's the editor of Writing on the Wall, selected prison writings of Mumia Abu-Jamal, and she also produced a film on Mumia called Justice on Trial, the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal. Her awards include the Fulbright Scholars Grant to Middle East and North Africa. That took her to Jordan, and a National Endowment for Humanities Fellowship in the Scholars in Residence program at Schoenberg, at the Schoenberg Center. She also directed and co-curated Presente, The Young Lords in New York, an exhibit in 3 New York City museums that was cited in the New York Times as one of 2015 top best art and top 10 best in art for that year. Dr. Fernández received her BA in Literature and American Civilization from Brown University. She also holds a PhD in US History from Columbia University. And she, last but not least, is the host of A New Day, WBIA's morning show in New York City that airs every Monday through Thursday from 7 to 8 on 99.5 FM. Thank you again so much, Dr. Fernández, to make time out of your day to talk to some silly guy in the Deep South about your work and what you're doing now. I also wanted to talk with you, and I mentioned this before we started recording, about kind of your journey to socialism and kind of what that means to you as well. But could you just talk a little bit about the Young Lords? And I haven't, I've tried to do a little research on it, but I haven't heard you talk about why you chose that really large project to do.
So first of all, thank you for inviting me. And
it's my pleasure.
There's no audience that's too small and no region of the country that's insignificant, or the world for that matter. The Young Lords are the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party. They're a 60s era organization that emerged first in Chicago. The organization was transformed from street organization to revolutionary group. And the progenitor of that transformation was the leader of the street organization or gang, Jose Chacha Jimenez, who was radicalized in prison. And we're talking about very, very young people. But of course, he was radicalized in the 1960s, a moment of possibility and transformation, inspired by Martin Luther King, whose writings he read in prison. He also read Malcolm X's autobiography in prison, but also the writings of a monk,
Merton.
Thomas Merton.
Yeah, I found that fascinating that he had read Merton.
Yeah.
7-Story Mountain, right?
7-Story Mountain, absolutely. And the organization quickly spread to New York, where a group of first-generation college students learned about the Young Lords and its transformation from Puerto Rican and Mexican gang to political revolutionary organization. That captured their imagination. They traveled to Chicago in a car to get permission to launch a chapter of the group in New York. And the Young Lords are known for pressuring the city through militant protest to pass its first anti-lead poisoning legislation. And it drafted the first known patient Bill of Rights, something that we take for granted today. The notion that the patient has a right to be treated with dignity by a doctor, and that the doctor has the responsibility to tell the patient what's wrong and how are we going to deal with the situation. Right. We take all of this for granted now, right. But in that period, doctors didn't have good manners, right? They looked down on their patients. They were very paternalistic, not only with Black American and Latinx patients, with everybody. And so part of what we see is that the struggle of young people, revolutionaries in particular, expand the experience of freedom for people who experience discrimination, medical discrimination, like people of color, but for everyone. Right. In American society. And so I've written this book, and one of the things I discovered in researching for the book was that these radicals that we think of as, I don't know, whatever you think about when you think about the Black Panther Party, were ironically involved in a lot of issues concerning health. Yeah. And our mortality. Right. And our deepest humanity. Fascinating. So I answer that question, why health, in like 2 or 3 different chapters in the book.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points that I found pretty fascinating. Was folks were a gang for a reason, though, right? It was a way to counter white racism, it was really a reaction to some of that, right? So I found that really fascinating. I also found it fascinating kind of, and I was hoping you'd speak to it, kind of what movement involvement does to kind of for personal transformation, that folks, I don't know, I think I saw a talk where you said this, but kind of where folks who are kind of lumpen proletariats, right, that develop a political analysis, and that analysis is liberating in ways where all of a sudden the things you've internalized, and I'm blathering on here, I know, become structural instead. Can you just speak to that a little bit? Because it seems to me that the Young Lords went through a transformation process, not just politically, but otherwise as well.
So 2 areas of inquiry here. Why did young people join gangs, young people of color? In a city like Chicago and New York, gangs were a way of life, and most gangs, all gangs, were populated mostly by working class, ethnic white folks. Gangs and street organizations were about protecting turf historically. Right. And after World War II, what we see in cities like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, is a mass migration of people of color from countryside to city. Black Americans are migrating to cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, from the South in pursuit of wartime jobs, but also Mexicans from the Southwest, Mexican Americans from the Southwest, from Mexico. Native Americans are migrating into the cities, yeah, which is something that people are not aware of. Yeah. And Puerto Ricans are migrating from the island of Puerto Rico, which is colonized by the United States, to cities like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. Right. So this is the moment when cities become associated with people of color, in part because there is a white migration out of the cities into the suburbs. Right. But in Chicago, there's still a white working class majority that doesn't welcome the new working class.
Right.
And so these gangs become a way for people of color to literally survive against white reaction to their right to the city,
Right.
to the neighborhoods, to jobs, to parks, to pools, to the beach.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And I tell many of these stories of how the gangs desegregated public life with brawn. So those battles were had out in the streets of Philadelphia, on the beach, in the parks, you know, in schoolyards. And so, you know, gangs were in the beginning white working class formations that worked, interestingly enough, with police departments and with political bureaucracies to maintain the demographic character and the racial character of neighborhoods, but also to collect votes and to keep people from voting, people of color.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Sounds familiar. And so in many ways, the new migrants who are people of color are forced to create pre-existing formations as a kind of self-defense. And then the other question you ask is related, because part of what I argue in that first chapter of the book, which charts the transformation of Cha-Cha Jimenez, the leader of the gang, from gang leader to political actor. Part of what I explore is, well, how does personal transformation happen? And that's not particular to Black Americans or Puerto Ricans or Mexicans or Native Americans. That's a profoundly human process, right? The question, who am I? And what is my relationship to my family? What's my relationship to my community, to the nation? Yeah. It's an existential question that ultimately has profound meaning in the project of living a life larger than yourself, right? Which is what we all aspire to, or should.
Yeah.
If we're going to have meaning in our lives when we're at that store.
It's also kind of claiming agency, right, too.
Yes, absolutely. Claiming agency and control over your life. So part of what we learn is that when you engage in collective action and when you start asking questions about your society, you're ultimately asking questions about yourself, how you've been programmed, and how you've been socialized. And that involves a journey that's often very painful, right? When you start to realize, oh, this is what I was taught, or I learned how to hate myself because I'm part of the working class. And in American society, we don't like to talk about the working class. It's better to assume that we're all middle class because somehow
we're failed if we're not, right?
What was that?
We're kind of failed people if we're not middle class.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that project of deconditioning is influenced by politics and a deeper understanding of how power works.
Right.
And that involves reading.
Right.
And when you're in an organization that seeks to transform the world, there's an enormous amount of self-education that the project demands of you about history, about the structures that produce the inequality in society. And so in this process of wrestling with yourself, the problems in society, the structures of capitalism, ideology, how we've been taught by the family, the institution of the family, by our schools, by the media, by the courts and the laws about who we are and what our place in society is. When you start to question society and your place in it, you get a little uncomfortable.
You make other people uncomfortable too.
And you make other people
Right,
uncomfortable
right.
too, but it
Right.
makes you uncomfortable because you have to, you're confronted, if you are going to be honest and not in denial,
Right.
with all of the things that you've taken for granted all of your life. So for example, in my classes, I ask my students, when we're talking about ideology, which is not something that's easy to understand, it's
Right.
essentially your perception of the world
That we
and
use while
reality.
we talk about ideology too, right?
Yeah, and your place in it.
Yeah.
So I ask my students, well, where did this notion come from that girls should wear pink and boys should wear blue? Is that natural? Or is that something that was taught? And what are the implications of those colors for how you're perceived in the world, but also what you do and how you act? Because when you look at kids, little girls and little boys, girls can be as rambunctious as boys, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
if you're a parent, you know that.
Right.
But at a certain moment, girls are taught to contain
Right.
their fire.
Kind of policed, right?
They're policed. Yeah, they're policed.
Yeah.
So that's not natural.
Right.
That is taught by the standards and norms of society for a particular end.
Right.
And so these are the questions that all revolutionaries, certainly the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, but generations and generations of people who've wanted to change the world have addressed. And I was going to say something that now escapes me. Yes, the Young Lords called ideology colonized mentality. The idea that as Black people, as Puerto Ricans, as Hispanics and Latinos, you're taught to hate yourself because the norm that is valued, respected, and presented as worthy in society is always white.
Right.
That's the mainstream. And everyone else is considered other, un-American. And so that produces a profound injury on the individual. That's one of the elements of racism that most people don't really think about.
Yeah. Kind of the
Right?
psychic violence.
The psychic violence. Like if you send a message to a child that they're bad, that they're not the norm, that they're marginal, that they're not beautiful,
Right.
it injures the person's soul,
Right.
psyche,
Right.
self-esteem, confidence. And so in this conversation about racism, I think it's important to talk about structures, but it's also important to talk about what racism does to the individual, to the child, to our humanity, and to the humanity of the oppressed, but also how it disfigures
Right.
the oppressor, right? And how it strips the humanity and the empathy or seeks to, of white Americans.
Yeah, I would agree. I think of Paulo Freire, right, in terms of the pedagogy of the oppressed, but there's so much in here to talk about. And I really like to talk more about kind of hegemonic ideology, but because I've always advocated for what would a detox or rehab program look like if we had one for capitalism, you know, or white supremacy, or any system of oppression, patriarchy, right? What would that program look like to kind of unpack how we've all been shaped to behave, think, feel? And I think the power of ideology, to me, that is most impressive and lethal, is the ability to limit what people can imagine. You know, because when you talk with people about capitalism, for example, they act as if it's quote unquote natural instead of an economic system that's about 2.5 centuries old, right? But back to the Young Lords for just a sec. So there's so many things that you mentioned. They're a multi-ethnic group, right? So it wasn't kind of homogenous for Puerto Ricans. There was this, I didn't realize until I started reading your book, that I guess it was Operation Bootstrap, but like a third of Puerto Rico left and came to the US, right? And again, I think we have to acknowledge the history of the colonization and invasion of Puerto Rico as a US territory. I don't know if it's still going on, but I used to know colleagues and activists that were doing work around Vieques. I think it was Vieques, right? The bombing range. And there was a big, at that time, push for independence versus kind of statehood, and folks were struggling with that there. But we're talking about young folks that are probably second generation, right, in Chicago and New York. I thought it was also, and you mentioned it, some of how AIM formed, from my understanding, was kind of the urbanization of Native American folks, right? Who then bumped into each other and were like, holy cow, we're all having this common experience in the American experience, and movement kind of forms out of that as well.
So absolutely, there's a lot there. Let's start with Puerto Ricans. So the Young Lords are a self-professed revolutionary nationalist organization that stands for the independence of Puerto Rico and its decolonization.
As a nation state.
As a nation state. So Puerto Rico, the island, is colonized by the United States in 1898,
right,
during the Spanish-American War. The territory of Puerto Rico, but also Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam are acquired by the United States during the Spanish-American War, and the United States retains Puerto Rico.
Right.
The significance of the United States, the significance of Puerto Rico for the United States is geostrategic. This is a moment when American empire is flexing its muscle in the late 19th century. Why? Because at the end of the 19th century, the United States is producing more goods than it can consume at home. So it's going to need international markets to sell those goods so that it won't experience a crisis of overproduction, right? That's what depressions are about.
Can't glut the market, right?
Crises of overproduction, more goods produced by capitalism than can be consumed. So you need to expand. Capitalism is inherently expansionistic for that reason. Puerto Rico is critical to the United States because it's a gateway to Latin American markets. And so it establishes a military foothold in Puerto Rico, from which it launches all of its military operations and wars and invasions in the 20th century. In 1947, the United States leads an industrialization project of the island called Operation Bootstrap. And that industrialization project produces more unemployment and more displaced farmers than the new semi-industrial economy can absorb. But the project knew that this was going to happen, and so it created an escape valve for that mass of humanity that wouldn't be employed by the new industries. These folks who were farmers who are now displaced are funneled into cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York by the US government and its managerial class in Puerto Rico.
And these are U.S. multinationals in Puerto Rico, right?
U.S. multinationals in collaboration with politicians in Puerto Rico who are in favor of this colonial project.
Yeah, kind of neo-colonial, right?
But also the U.S. government.
Yeah.
So this is a project of migration that is literally organized by the US government, wherein a third of the people of the island of Puerto Rico are funneled out of the island into American cities.
Yeah.
Think about the dismemberment of culture and a people that happens when a third
right.
of the people are forced out because of unemployment and because of this chaos produced by the industrialization project. So this happens in 1947. During this period, from 1947 to 1960, more Puerto Ricans are settling in New York than Black Americans.
Oh.
And what historians say is that that mass transfer of humanity from one island was tantamount to the mass of humanity that migrated out of Europe to the United States in the late 19th century.
Wow.
From all of the countries of Europe. But this was happening in one small island. And essentially that's the fallout of colonization. It's exploitation and displacement on steroids.
Right.
Concentrated in one small island.
Right.
That interrupts the family life, the culture, the stability, the sense of belonging, and the life chances of a third of a country. Anyway, these people settle. And so part of what I am fascinated by is that the young lords emerge to explain in part that transfer of humanity that they weren't aware of and their parents weren't consciously tracking and documenting. They weren't consciously tracking and documenting what structural, political, and economic forces drove this mass migration.
Right.
I think it's important to say that migration is a profoundly traumatic experience. I mean, moving.
One of the biggest stressors you can have.
Is one of the biggest stressors you can have, moving from one house to the other. Imagine moving to another country. Yeah. People move because they are displaced by larger forces. People migrate, right? Because they're displaced by larger forces. And part of what is clear, and as a historian, is that Operation Bootstrap was to Puerto Ricans what the North American Free Trade Agreement
I was fixing to
was
say
for Mexicans.
Yeah.
So the North American Free Trade Agreement allowed American agribusinesses to set up shop in Mexico.
Yeah.
And they displaced small Mexican farmers.
Right.
A mass of humanity.
Right.
Displaced by American capitalism and business. And where are those Mexicans going to land?
Right.
In pursuit of survival, they're going to land in California and in Texas and in New York City.
Right.
New York City. So the young lords, fascinatingly enough, organized in East Harlem, which was the Puerto Rican barrio, the Puerto Rican neighborhood, had historically been where Puerto Ricans settled. And by the 1990s and 2000s, that Puerto Rican neighborhood became a Mexican neighborhood as a result of the North American Free Trade Agreement and the ways in which it pushed farmers out and into cities like New York in pursuit of survival jobs.
Right.
So the young lords are the children of migration, and they captured the imagination of their generation because they were able to explain to their peers why their parents were so angry, why their parents were displaced on a mass scale, why they became the super exploited class of workers in New York City, working under the worst conditions, poor salaries, but also depicted as the children of a lesser god, racialized because of the work they did in the factories, but also as essential workers, as domestics, and as the janitors and the orderlies in the hospitals, the lowest, most exploited workers in the public hospitals in New York City. That's usually what revolutionaries do. I mean, revolutionaries have a bad rap, but ultimately revolutionaries seek to address the root causes of social problems.
Well, that's what it means to be radical, right? To kind of get at the root. But can we just, I wanted to stay with this point you made, because I think a lot of folks that'll listen to this haven't gone to college. They don't know about neocolonial theory or, words like colonization. I mean, Puerto Rico really, number one's invaded in 1898, right? Becomes this territory that was disruptive. I think there was in terms of governmental structures were changed once it becomes a territory, right? Folks have to contend with that. And then kind of, I mean, what sociologists would call neocolonialism is the latest form of US multinationals coming in, right, to sell goods, but also find cheap labor. And folks kind of get pushed out, as you said, and then they go to some place that doesn't want them.
Right, exactly.
No,
it's fascinating. So what was Operation Bootstrap about? It was the new frontier of American capitalism after World War II. So American businesses set up shop in Puerto Rico. The pharmaceutical industry set up shop in Puerto Rico, and they got rent-free real estate and tax breaks. It was a tax haven where the pharmaceutical industry set up shop. And that pharmaceutical industry also ended up having access to guinea pigs. So the pill, the birth control pill, was tested in Puerto Rico, and a third of the women of the island were, their birth process was permanently disrupted by this experimentation. And so the industrialization project, you listen to that and it seems like, well, that's a good thing. Doesn't industrialization expand the productive capacity of a society? Well, it does, mostly in the interest of profits for the big corporations. And the people at the bottom of society serve as exploitable labor that's barely eking out a living day to day, and that often can't produce, can't buy, can't afford to buy without credit the very goods they are producing more effectively and cheaper than ever. These are the contradictions of
that, and I, the thing I always ask people to think about, not only is there's kind of profit motive and political ends of going to other places, right? But regulation in general. American workers had to fight to get minimum wage, child labor laws, would go down the list. And a lot of, this is again, NAFTA, maquiladores and factories in Mexico or even in Asia, right? Where those rules don't necessarily apply. So, our consumptive habits to me are a moral question. And very few of us think about these things that come back to us that we now consume. Is there blood on them? Who made them and so forth. So getting people to think about that, because I have a friend that worked for the NSA, and I did a podcast with him. He was in the Army for 20 years, and I asked him if he thought we were an empire. And he was absolutely not, because we're not taking territory in the traditional sense of empire, right? But it was pretty clear that I don't think he had ever thought about neo-colonialism, that the relocation of multinationals somewhere else to do things.
Well, I think in many ways, neo-colonialism is more pernicious.
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
it's less obvious.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
It's
polite.
Kind of, now you see it, now you don't. It's
you can also sell the idea that you're creating jobs and you're raising the income of people elsewhere, right?
Right. But just to go back to this issue of colonialism in Puerto Rico, because there's nothing neo about colonialism in Puerto Rico. The United States controls the country economically, and Puerto Ricans are not allowed to vote for the president of the United States.
Right.
They have representatives that are part of Congress, but those representatives in Congress have very little voting power.
Right.
So it's a colonial system, a system in which the people of the island of Puerto Rico do not have full control over the politics and economy of their island.
Right.
The United States lords over the island paternalistically.
Absolutely.
And at different moments, the language that Puerto Ricans speak, Spanish, has been dismissed, and English became the official language of instruction in schools.
Wow.
When Puerto Ricans started fighting for independence, their flag was made illegal. The Puerto Rican flag was illegal. It became illegal to play music in Puerto Rico that upheld independent themes surrounding the independence of the island. This is stuff that Americans wouldn't tolerate, that in fact Americans didn't tolerate, which is why 1776, the American Revolution, happened.
Right.
Because England was essentially controlling the life of the colonies more than the colonies were willing to accept. Now that story is a lot more complicated than the one we've been instructed about in school. But just for a second, if you allow me, there is a brilliant book by, it's right here, in fact. It's like my little Bible. It's called Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. It's a history of the Second Amendment, which, if we think about, since I'm talking to folks in the South, when you think about the Second Amendment, who do you think about? You think about white folks. That amendment is not a right that when you think about, you associate with Black people or Native Americans or Latinos. And you have to ask yourself, pourquoi? Why? How is that? How did that come into being? And part of what she outlines in this very, very short volume, and Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is a celebrated historian, she explains that if you think about the birth of the United States, the very borders of the emerging state had to be protected by armed colonists who were fighting against the Native Americans from the go.
Right.
Because when we think about Native Americans, we like to think about them as people who were killed, devastated, eviscerated by Europeans. But the Native Americans, in fact, fought back, right? Yeah. Their lands were being occupied, and they fought back. And so the emerging state of Virginia established a law that colonists had to go to church with arms. And this emerging state of Virginia, in fact, subsidized gun ownership and the purchasing of bullets for those who couldn't afford it, because it expected the citizens to help protect the lands occupied by the European colonists. And it also expected citizens to protect against slave rebellions.
Right.
And so the Second Amendment emerges before 1776, before the American Revolution and the drafting of the Constitution. It was already intact. In many ways, the birth of this country was one that demanded armed violence on the part of white citizens against Native Americans and enslaved Africans. That is deep. That means that white supremacy is part of the DNA of the formation of the country.
Which is a big question in itself of how do you alter DNA? That's one I always raise, when I talk with folks about, other analogies are it's woven into the fabric of the nation, full steam ahead.
Loaded.
Yeah.
A disarming history.
I'll check it out. Yeah.
Of the Second Amendment. Not clear why this came up, but right. So this is, remember earlier we talked about socialization. People in the South love their guns.
They do in rural Oregon too, though. I would say in rural America, right?
Well, I think in all of America, because people in New Jersey,
right,
love their guns. I think white Americans love their guns, and that's how you grow up.
Right.
But at some point, if you are a moral, ethical person and you come across this history, you have to interrogate the origins of that love. And that's often a painful process, because I'm sure that white Americans have a cultural affinity to these guns. They're unaware of the political origins of this love and cultural affinity. And then when confronted with this, you have to make a decision. Am I going to stand in denial, or am I going to be bigger than that and acknowledge that this that I cling on to culturally, which defines who I am and my place in this society, is actually tied to bloodshed and the evisceration of a people.
Right. Well, I think I want to come back to the young lords in just a second, but to confront American history for white folks is to face an existential crisis, right? And then we have this vacuous identity because the myths and lies, don't hold up. And there's a part of me, not that I'm really interested in neurobiology, about, let me put it differently. I've done a lot of work around kind of Civil War monuments, and we were trying to get them down a while back. Did all the research. The Georgia secession statement mentioned slavery over 30 times. But when Trump got elected and came up with the idea of fake news on the West Coast, all my West Coast friends were kind of traumatized. And I just said, welcome to the South. Because there's this way that the South, and 22,000 folks that were in reenactments a couple of years ago here, truth is irrelevant. Historical fact is irrelevant. And in fact, let me put it differently, and I see this now with kind of the attack on critical race studies, attack on discussions of whiteness, right? It's framed as un-American, right? I mean, it seems to me to be an American, to ask any critical questions of our country is un-American in the world that I move in here, and as well as other rural places I've lived, that you simply, you don't ask those questions, and you hate your country if you ask questions. And I've got some theories about why that is, but in terms of kind of punching through ideology, particularly when it's tied to identity for white America, I've been, I took that whole Panther adage of go organize white folks real seriously, but we're too invested, I think on an emotional and psychic and existential level. And it seems to me that's what Trump is all about, in some regards. It's a last vestige, but I don't want to go down that road if that's okay.
Wait, I think this is important. And I know that you don't want to make this podcast too long, but
no, we can talk as long as you want. Yeah.
But why do you think that questioning America is immediately perceived as unpatriotic among white Americans?
Yeah, I think unconsciously we know that we have privilege. We know that the country was stolen. We know it was based and built on genocide or attempted genocide of indigenous folks. I think we know that for 246 years, white folks owned other folks. And then for another 75, that, debt peonage. I think we know, particularly in places like here, that is fraught with atrocities that have been buried. I mean, folks would have been disappeared by the hundreds for absolutely nothing at times, right? For just challenging the white social order. I think we know on some level, but again, as we started talking about, engage in that conversation and truth tell, right? We're going to be lost. We're not going to know who we are if we're not superior, and I think in some ways it's cognitive dissonance. It's easier to claim people are communist or they hate their country than to be adults, right? Who can engage in that conversation courageously and indefinitely, no matter where it takes us. And the other irony here on the buckle of the Bible Belt is that these are folks who worship a Middle Eastern guy they turned into a white guy. Like it's the schizophrenia, as Dr. King talked about, like is multi-layered. I would argue, like you say you worship a guy who is certainly not a white guy, right? Who talks about peacemaking and loving your enemy and loving your neighbor, but we can still own our guns, we can still do all these other things. So there's, and you said this earlier, I just think it's sick societies produce sick people.
Yes, sick societies produce sick people and unhappy people.
Yeah.
And alienated people.
Yeah.
And people who in crisis implode.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is a crisis in white America. White men are committing suicide at high rates. Yeah. There's an opioid crisis of epic proportion. And people are miserable and projecting that misery onto Black Americans and immigrants.
Yeah, anybody who's not, but you can't talk about capitalism because that, to me, is the national religion, right? To say it's the structure, to say that the aristocracy who set up this country weren't really about freedom or democracy, only for them, right? The 1% of the 1700s, right? To confront that again is not only to not know who I am, but not to know my own damn country. Like,
Right.
and that turns, I mean, there's a word in sociology, anomy, this notion of, you've probably heard it, but normlessness, and or when just too much social change happens, right? That, I mean, I think it's no accident that the slogan for Trump was to make America great again. And the thing I keep harping on was, what's the date for that? Well, when exactly in time was America great, and great for who? Right. But
Well, I think that that's a fascinating slogan that has historical roots, right? To the South.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of that quote by James Baldwin, that history is not in the past. We actually live history today, and we owe our perspective and our points of reference to history in ways that we're not aware of. So since we're talking about the South, I like to I teach Reconstruction and the Civil War. And I like to tell my students, quoting Barbara Fields, I'm not sure if you've read that incredible article, which everybody has to read, from the South. It's not an easy article to read, but once you get through it, you are a completely different human being. It's called Slavery, Race, and Ideology in the United States of America. Slavery, Race, and Ideology in the United States of America. So the article starts by questioning our assumptions about race and racism. For example, there are books that are written by authors, and if the book is written by a Black author, it's a Black author. This country is obsessed with race, but when we talk about race, the assumption is that it's Black people we're talking about. And she goes on and on and on to interrogate race ideology and how it functions. And I'll remind our listening audience that race does not exist as a biological category, something that most Americans don't understand. Like, it's not a significant biological category. It's a trait that's insignificant to the physical makeup of human beings. It's superficial.
It's like having hair or not having hair.
Huh?
Like
hair. It's like, birds in New York. There are some brown birds and some gray birds.
Right.
We would never say, oh, those brown birds
aren't birds.
They're going to actually poop on you whenever they come near you, because they're brown. I mean, it's absurd, right? It's a very superficial component of the makeup of a being. Anyway, so she then goes on to say, well, where does this race ideology come from? And she, of course, ties this to slavery. And then she says, but even our understanding of slavery is mired in race ideology, because even historians will tell you that slavery was the great segregator. And she says, if slavery were about segregation, why go through the trouble of bringing the Africans to America?
Right.
Why not just leave the Africans in Africa? Slavery is first and foremost an economic system concerned with the production of cotton, indigo, coffee, sugar, cash crops for exchange in a global market, right? With labor that's enslaved. And what we see emerging in the United States and in the Americas are slave societies, different from societies with slaves, right? This is what the study of slavery has brought us, and understanding that in societies of antiquity, there were societies with slaves. In those societies, the institution economically of slavery was not foundational to those societies.
Right.
You could actually figure out a way out of your status.
Right.
In slave societies that only emerge in the Americas, and there are only 3 slave societies in human history: the Southern United States, the Caribbean, and Brazil. In these societies, the economic organization of those societies is organized around slavery, and slavery drives the politics and economy and survival and reproduction of those societies. So it's an economic system that's foundational.
That's a huge point to folks who because one of the things you get from white Southerners, and I've gotten this from students over the years, well, Africans had slaves too, or Egyptians had slaves too, but that's a big distinction: societies with slaves versus societies basically built on, and we're talking chattel slavery, right?
Chattel slavery. And in these societies, it's impossible to overcome your status as a slave. You can't marry out of it. You can't buy yourself out of it. You're a slave for life.
And so are your children.
And so are your children.
Yeah.
What does this produce in the South? It produces the second slavery in the South, the second wealthiest society humanity had seen, second only to the British Empire. 4 million slaves produced the second wealthiest society humanity had seen, second only to the British Empire. It was one of the most exploitative slave societies in the Americas of the 3.
Right.
And as you all know, the Civil War was tied up with this question of slavery.
Right.
And what happens after the Civil War is that the old slave owners, the old planter class, launches a counter-revolution to return Southern society to as close a replica as possible to slavery. And who are we talking about? It's not the majority of white folks. It's a very, very small layer of white slave owners whose interests are very different than those of the majority of poor white farmers. And in fact, after the Civil War, many white farmers began to see that they had more in common with the freedmen, with the freed enslaved Africans, than with the old planter class that was buying up all of the land. But let's talk about the counter-revolution, because all counter-revolutions in history are violent and deploy terror. It's no surprise that the KKK emerges during Reconstruction, actually in 1865. It's a terrorist organization that deploys terror against the freedmen and all those who support them, because the object of the old planter class that's invited to remake the new society is to control Black labor. So they're going to deploy terror to do that, to contain Black folks, terrorize them into submission and into signing a contract with the old slave owners. So the white supremacy that is vitriolic today is the strategy used by the old planter class to protect its class interests after the institution of slavery has been abolished by the Civil War. The problem with the Civil War is that it abolishes the system of slavery, but it doesn't produce an economic system in its stead. And so there's a battle over what that new system is going to look like. And unfortunately, because the old planter class, the losing side of the revolution, is invited back, they're going to go after those who challenged them with a vengeance,
Right.
with blood, terror. Interestingly enough, I like to remind,
And legality.
yes,
Right.
I mean, they use terror, they use the
Yeah, it was
law, the black
multifaceted.
codes,
Yeah.
right? They use the black codes. The old planter class decides that it's going to join both parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. They are going to disenfranchise both poor whites and the freedmen. That's what the freed enslaved Africans were called during that period. But this is something I tell my students. During the American Revolution, did we invite the British back into the new society to help us rebuild it?
Did we erect statues to them 40, 50 years later? We can go down
Exactly.
the list. Right.
But in fact, the monuments are part of the strategy of white supremacy launched by the old planter class to essentially brainwash poor whites into believing that the system of old, the system of slavery, was the moment when America was great.
Right.
Right? Yeah. And that somehow Black people had destroyed that old society, and that Black people were unfit for the job and were responsible for all of the hardship that poor whites were experiencing.
And victimization.
In any case, the history of Reconstruction, I mean, you know this, is one of the most fascinating moments in American history, and one that determines the future of the country and its racial ideology.
Right.
Completely. I mean, I think that Trump's victory was a consolidation, however many years later, of the counter-revolution of the old planter class. The counter-revolution it launched to regain power. And there was a challenge to that during the civil rights movement, right? To the power of the old planter class. It's a complicated story. One of the reasons why the civil rights movement succeeded was because the South had to be deindustrialized. Right. The South was industrialized in the 1930s, and during World War II, the birth of cities like Birmingham was part of that industrialization of the South, and that weakened the power of this planter class.
Right.
Objectively, it weakened its economic power. And that opened up the possibility for Black people who became urbanized with the industrialization of the South to gain power both economically and politically, and to launch a project for their humanity, right? And for their rights, both politically and economically. But ultimately, white folks who are poor, working class, were brainwashed by an aristocratic white class that had nothing in common economically with either white farmers or Black farmers. In fact, determined the poverty of the entire region for over 100 years.
Right.
I mean, I'm going on and on.
Yeah, no. I mean, I would argue, would you also agree that the planter class really sold the Civil War to poor white folk?
That the planter sold? Oh, absolutely.
Sold the idea to it, right? I mean, it just reminded me when Ted Cruz and Donald Trump and the rest of them are getting kind of these white folks to storm the Capitol. It's the oligarchs always get other folks to do their work for them, right? Folks that have real no interest. Let me ask you this, because
I mean, Trump didn't show up.
Yeah. Of course he did.
He invited people. He said that he was going to march to the Capitol, but he disappeared.
Yeah. Well, and not to kind of belabor the Civil War stuff, right? Most folks don't know that, people paid for substitutions to fight for them, right? If they had so many slaves, they wouldn't have to fight. I mean, the aristocrats really orchestrated the whole thing and got poor white folks who probably wanted to be slaveholders, right, to fight and kill 600,000 of one another. Let me ask you this, because I talked to, Reverend William Barber.
Of course, yes.
Right. So I was talking to some of his folks, and I listened to a talk with him in Cornell West recently, and he argues that this is just a second Reconstruction.
Right.
That what we're going through now is a response to the first biracial president, the response to social and political changes that have made the playing field a little more level. It's, I would argue it's one of the first times that those of us who are white and male actually have to compete with other folks for positions. And now, of course, we're perceiving ourselves as victims, because again, that's not the way things should be working. And if my world's not perfect, it must be somebody's fault. Right. I mean, do you think Reverend Barber's analysis is applicable?
Yeah, but what exactly does that mean? Yes, absolutely. This is a second Reconstruction. But ultimately, what is undergirding this crisis that we're living through in America? It's not the first time there's been a crisis, but what's at the core? As in the experience of Reconstruction, what was at stake was the economic and political reorganization of society. In whose interest was Southern society going to be rebuilt?
Right.
Was it going to be rebuilt in the interest of those at the bottom of society, working class and peasant, farmer, Black and white folks? Or was it going to be built in the economic and political interest of the aristocratic planter class?
Right.
Race was used, white supremacy literally was a strategy used, the notion of the inferiority of the freedmen and the Black people was used to brainwash literally poor whites into siding with the old planter class.
Right.
In this instance, we have an economic crisis. Capitalism is in crisis.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean exactly? I mean, everybody's experiencing it.
I don't think the stock market, right? I mean, there's this interesting phenomenon of mass displacement of workers, massive wealth and income inequality that's been building for 4 decades now. But the stock market and the elite seem to continue to cash out,
Right. But it's actually, yes, over the last 40, 50 years, we've seen wages stagnate.
Right.
In the United States, prices go up, but our wages remain the same. Unions have been busted over the last 40 years. But why is this happening? And I won't start with 1973, I'll start with the last recession. So there was a recession in 2008, 2007, right? 2007. Right. Why do recessions happen? Recessions happen and depressions because capitalism blindly produces goods that it sells in the market for a profit. But capitalists compete with each other, and there's no rhyme or reason to how much the factory or the corporation is going to produce.
Right.
Every corporation is its own entity, and it produces and produces and produces because it wants to corner the market. It doesn't want to be found without the good that the market is procuring. So what happens every 7 to 10 years, according to the capitalists themselves, is a recession.
Right.
More goods produced by capitalism than it can absorb domestically or internationally, in part because the profit motive demands cutting costs, which means the cheapest wage just possible. Cutting labor costs,
Right.
which means that workers are producing and producing and producing, but they don't make enough money to consume the goods the market is creating. And so they have to take out loans, and they have to do crazy
Income
things.
households, we can go down a litany, right? Credit,
The whole thing. Okay, so between 2008 to 2019, there's been a struggle. Forget about us, the little people. There's been a struggle among capitalists domestically and economically to get themselves out of this recession. And in the United States, the market has not grown at 3% from 2008. Actually, it's been a minute since the US government has grown at 3%, which is what constitutes a healthy economy, if it grows at 3%,
Right.
which is why when you're asking for a wage increase, you ask for a 3% raise.
Right.
That's legitimate. If it's not 3%, you're falling behind.
Right.
So essentially, capitalism hasn't been able to find the markets domestically or internationally that's making it the profits it needs to survive, to make all of the profits it needs for reinvestment to happen. So that's what's undergirding what's going on. That there is a deep crisis of capitalism, the logic of the system, production for the purposes of producing profits for a class of people who own and control the means of production. That's not working out.
Right.
It's actually trickled down in the form of de-industrialization for white Americans in all different pockets in the country. No, my white American brothers and sisters, that when we think of de-industrialization, we think of white America, but that was something that Black people and Latinos already went through. So de-industrialization begins in the United States for the first time after World War II, when the factories start leaving the cities to the suburbs and the South in stages.
Yeah.
And
they came here because there were no unions.
Exactly. And so then and the factories were looking to lower production costs.
Right.
And so at the moment when Black Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Mexicans are migrating en masse to the cities, where people are expected to find jobs, low wage jobs, but they're going to find jobs. That stops. Think about it.
Yeah.
So that stops. And so in the 1960s, of course, this is going on, and the system itself is unaware that this is going on. But finally, in 1965 and 1966, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says, oh, snap, there's a crisis in the cities. There are pockets of Black and Latino men who've dropped out of the labor market because after a year of looking for work, they were not able to find work.
Right.
And so now they're committed to an underground economy. Why? Because jobs and factories have left the city en masse. And this has produced, for the first time in human history, permanent unemployment in the city.
Right.
Something that has never happened, because historically cities have been very dynamic economic sites of exchange. So what white America is experiencing now, Black people and Latinos have been experiencing since World War II. Right.
Well, can you elaborate on underground economies? Because that's the way we criminalize folks, right? Right. You know, so that's Eric Garner selling, were they singles or not singles, but loosies.
So if you can't make a living in a, formal job, by going to a workplace or being hired in a factory or in security or whatever, what have you. If the economy is not producing formal, legitimate jobs, people have to find a means of survival somehow. And so they start selling things informally. How? In Staten Island, Eric Garner, who was killed by Pantaleo, a cop, had been persecuted and harassed by that same cop for selling single cigarettes in the street corner. So he would buy, cartons of cigarettes and would sell them individually to people who smoke but can't afford to buy a $15 pack of Marlboros, which is what they cost in New York City, by the way.
Right. And he's an independent entrepreneur. We don't call him that, but he is. Right.
Anywhere else, under capitalism, he's a capitalist entrepreneur.
Yeah.
But because he doesn't have a permit, because he's Black, he's seen as a nuisance.
Right.
And his business activity is illegal, and so cops go after him. People selling water, right? At the corner or in the middle of a cross section, or selling roses. That's what Mexicans do in New York City. They sell flowers in a heavy trafficked area. Intersection. All of that is part of the underground economy that is necessary when people are not able to make ends meet or to find regular employment. Another element of the underground economy is the sale of marijuana. Right? So important for us to consider, because I just wrote a book about a street organization turned into revolutionary group, the Young Lords. Prior to the 70s and 80s, street organizations were not selling drugs because the economy didn't demand it, right? But with the rise of de-industrialization in the cities, the sale of drugs became an integral part of the underground economy. And that became violent because drugs are illegal. And so drugs, the sale of drugs is part of that underground economy, which fascinatingly enough is now legal.
Right. That's a
and so Black people and Latinos were literally given decades of prison time for selling marijuana, decades, and criminalized and demonized as super predators. And now white folks are selling marijuana like hotcakes, and it's trendy and respectable.
Oh, no, I lived in Portland when it got legalized, so
and it's hip and happening.
Well,
I mean, folks, you can't make this up.
Well,
it would be better for us to be comedians to talk about this craziness.
Well, and what you're talking about is a different kind of genocide. I mean, it really is. If you lock people out of the economic system, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I think about how many reservations worked, and so you isolate people or internal colonies, right? Who lose hope over time. I mean, we should talk about why people are medicating with drugs, right, as a form of psychological and spiritual escape, and medicating their life in order to get through days and stress and so forth, right? Then you criminalize them, right? I mean, there's this kind of harvesting system, because in capitalism too, we're all just resources to be commodified anyway. So then you create the prison industrial complex that gets privatized too. I mean, it's demented.
So let's talk about this, because I feel like these phrases are abstract for people who are not well versed in the language we use. So under capitalism, everything is up for sale. The system is organized around production for profit. And not everyone's profiting.
Right.
It's the fat cats.
Right.
It's those who own and control the means of production who get all of the profits. Everything is a commodity. Right. Education is a commodity. That's why so many Americans can't go to college. Yeah. Don't go to college. That's like for wealthy people. That's, you want to get into debt, go to college.
Right.
The best education is private, even in the lower schools. Healthcare, something as foundational to the survival of the species as medical care, is a for-profit system. Yeah.
It's a product you buy instead of a right.
It's a product you buy. You
if
pay
you can.
for.
If you can.
If you can. Most people can.
Right.
Food, real estate, like land. Land is something that you purchase. If aliens were to come down to Earth, they would probably not understand how it is that on Earth, human beings make profit over the sale of something we need for survival, like housing.
Right.
It doesn't make sense. In fact, Native Americans were like, what do you mean you own the land? There was no sense of private property. Like the concept of private property was not in the worldview of Native Americans, because they were like, what do you mean you own the land? No one owns the land. We all own the land. You don't own the air. It's like the land is like the air we breathe.
Right.
It's like owning the rain and the clouds.
Sky. Yeah.
And for the better part of human history, guess what? No one owned the land.
Yeah.
No one owned the land. So these things that we think are natural are in fact standards produced by the system in which we live, because the system itself, which is organized around profit, demands that we assume and believe that these things are natural. The best way to convince someone of something is by attaching it to human nature.
Yeah. The word natural is so dangerous.
And that's what's dangerous. We're all dupes.
Yeah.
At some point, we're all dupes.
Right.
Because before we get to think about these things and reflect on them, we assume that this is natural to pay mortgage that you can't afford.
Right.
And to live in your own home. You know how expensive and inefficient and horrific for the environment it is for every American to live in their own home
and have their own car, and
have their own car and heat their own apartment. Right. It's cuckoo. No, cuckoo. Especially given that we're all social animals. That's another thing, that Americans all live in their own little universe, in their own home, but human beings are social animals. We actually need each other and we want to be in community with each other.
Yeah.
But American society has atomized all of us.
Yeah.
It's turned us into individual automatrons who are alienated.
Right.
And we then therefore have to watch television all day. Right. In order to have some kind of meaning in our lives. But sorry, I'm sure you have a lot to say.
Well, I couldn't say any of that any better. I just think it's also just capitalism is immoral. It's antisocial. I remember going to a church camp or something one time, and someone broke out the game of Monopoly. And just kind of, I used to talk with students because everybody knows the game of Monopoly. We're exposed to it as tiny little people, right? And we would just talk about how good what kind of society does the game of Monopoly, create? And what is the ethic that drives the game of Monopoly? It's basically to destroy everybody and grab it all for yourself, so, but again, I think that for Americans, just getting people to think about that we literally sell our lifetime to an employer who generally is using us to make them money at a disproportionate rate is just something, again, I think most folks not only just assume as natural, but it's hard, especially here in a very conservative place, for people to consider other arrangements, whether that's formation of co-ops or collectives or sharing resources or cohabitation or, which all also goes against the kind of image of the American dream, right? Which is hyper individualistic, which is alienated, and so forth. But yeah, can we talk about the Lords just a little bit in terms of organizing? Because one of the things I was impressed by, because like the Panthers, they had a 13-point program, not a 10-point program, right? But most of what they did was, and you talked about this particularly with the garbage offensive, and I don't see this in activism today, and I'm wondering what your thoughts of what are called movements today, given your work on the Lords and your knowledge of AIM and everybody else. But it seemed to me that what folks did was try to live their values in order to engage people about developing an analysis of their situation. So instead of just kind of proselytizing and trying to lecture at people about kind of Marxist theory or critiques of capitalism, they were literally out doing lead testing for children. They were out sweeping the streets to make a statement about the lack of sanitation. They were out trying to get people medical care. They were feeding kids. And I think about that into today's notions of movements. And I guess this is a long way to say what I've seen people call movements. And I think BLM is probably just an extension of a multi-year century movement for Black liberation. But for example, the marches that were in response to Donald Trump, let me just put it this way. It seems to me today, I'm not sure, I really struggle with, are the movements of the 60s in that historic context possible today with the levels of individualism we have, number one, but also are people confusing marches with movements? Because I think those are a couple of different things. And I'm just wondering what you think, especially given the model that the Lords embodied in terms of their organizing and political work.
Yes, hold on. I should connect my computer so that I don't run out of battery. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay, I'm back on. Okay, so many questions there in one. I think the more we live, the more we see the significance of principles and values, which it seems the United States lacks profoundly right now. Not always.
Yeah.
But what kind of society do we want to live in? And who do we want to be in that society? And should the collective be prioritized, right? So healthcare, again, healthcare. We're the only country in the world, in the Western world, that doesn't think that healthcare is important for everyone to have access to. When we are dying, we're closest to our humanity, right? In many ways, that's the thing that makes us human, that there's an expiration and we're here for a limited time and we're mortal, we're gonna die. And it's that mortality, perhaps, that makes us ask the question, why? Why am I here? And who should I be? That's where values come in, right? So what are the values that should instruct me and my family and the collective and the nation? And should I live, what is it? A life that's that's higher, that aspires higher, something beyond myself as an individual, right? So, so the young lords, interestingly enough, were Marxists. They were self-proclaimed revolutionary nationalists and Marxists. They were influenced by the revolutionary theories emerging out of the struggles against colonial rule throughout Africa and Asia, because these continents had been colonized by the Europeans in the late 19th century. And by the mid 20th century, after World War II, because the Europeans had exhausted themselves in war,
Right.
the colonized countries like Vietnam and Algeria were like, oh, our colonizers have been weakened. It is possible now to launch a fight back that might objectively win. So the young lords in the United States, but also the Black Panthers and even Martin Luther King, they're influenced by what's going on internationally, like Gandhi in India.
Right.
And the movement, the nonviolent civil disobedience strategy of Martin Luther King is influenced by what's going on in India and that country's struggle against British colonial rule. So, but part of what the young lords are doing is that they're organizers. They're not really activists. They're grounded in community. They are propelled by the notion that we should fight for the highest aspirations of humanity, that every human being should be able to live their most creative, fullest life, that we have the capacity in this society to dream that dream. But we're not there. So what are our problems in East Harlem? And so they asked the community, what's a problem that we might tackle? And the people in the community say the garbage is out of control. The city doesn't pick up the garbage, and we think that they don't pick up the garbage because we're Black and Puerto Rican, because they think of us as garbage. And so the garbage truck comes, but it leaves the trash half strewn in the street, and we don't get regular services. So the young lords go to work, they start sweeping the street, but they're not service people. They're mavericks,
Right.
who have an understanding that in order to get change, you have to create a crisis. You have to engage in protest that stops the everyday, that business as usual. It stops business as usual and forces the government to respond to the needs of society. So they start sweeping, but they also put the trash in the middle of the street, stop traffic, and also get members of the community to participate in this process. And this calls the attention of the mayor. And their garbage dumping protests, which happened daily for like 3 months, end up making it into the mayoral debates of that term, of that fall. I think what you're getting at is that ultimately the young lords identified and wanted to identify an issue that could bring and amplify the notion of the collective good. And so they got more regular garbage pickup. But you know what? Garbage pickup was a disaster in all neighborhoods, white, Black, and Puerto Rican. Of course, it was because of racism. It was disproportionately felt in the Puerto Rican and Black neighborhoods. Why? Because the Irish and Italian garbage men employed racism in the work they did. They didn't care about the Puerto Rican and Black neighborhoods. But ultimately, all New Yorkers thought that this was a problem, the garbage, that the city, that folks were paying taxes and the city was not doing its job in collecting the garbage. So part of what the Young Lords did, and this was a dynamic process of employing a theory of the world, but also communicating with the people in East Harlem, the residents. It's a very dynamic conversation. Right. You come with a theory of the world and a critique of capitalism, but ultimately, if it's abstract and it doesn't speak to the needs of the people, it's not going to catch fire. Yeah. What the Young Lords did was that they chose an issue to organize around that amplified the concept of the common good. That's not easy to do.
Right.
But it's also like pedestrian, like it's every day, the garbage, right? There's nothing sexy about the garbage. It's like the damn garbage, but it needs to be picked up, and it can be picked up. Yeah. And when it's not picked up, people are a little, they're tight about it. It also feeds racism, because when you have communities where the garbage is strewn everywhere as a result of poor services, then that community becomes associated with dirty, nasty. They don't care about their community, but there's a structural underpinning to the garbage in East Harlem. It's not that Puerto Ricans are throwing garbage in the street. It's that there are no receptacles for garbage. Right. So part of what the Young Lords did was that they found an issue that amplified the common good, fought for reforms that in fact benefit everybody, because it forced the city to deliver on their promise to take care of the people of the city of New York. But the Young Lords also were not about the reform. They were also about suggesting that why not live in a society whose mission is to meet human need? And can we reorganize society such that we are all contributing to that process and not going to the slave every day? By the way, that's what Malcolm X called the job.
Right.
He called it the slave, which you referenced earlier. This is what we do. We are born, we live, and we die in the United States in this relationship that's exploitative and alienated to production and work. What's horrible about this is that work is a profoundly human thing, right? We need to work in the world to transform it, but also to seek meaning. But for the better part of human history, work was a lot more creative, and we had a lot more control over work than we do now. We don't have any control over our jobs any now, or what we produce. One of the things, and I'll end with this. I mean, when we, we think about skilled work like the tailors and the people who make hats and the cobblers. These are skilled workers who were engaged in production on a small scale, but the tailor had full control over what they produced. And in having full control and agency, you are connected to the creative process. When a tailor produces a beautiful dress or a suit, and you see it in the body of someone in your community, you walk around with a sense of meaning and pride and contribution. Capitalism eliminated all of that. And for those who are revolutionaries, who believe that a different world is possible, it's not necessarily about going back to recreate the past. It's about realizing that there is tremendous creativity and technological capacity under capitalism in the system in which we live. But the majority of people don't benefit from that at all. I mean, we live in a society that creates an enormous amount of wealth, but half the world goes hungry.
Right.
Here in the United States, there's hunger. It's crazy. Like, so can we reorganize production so that we are not a slave to the job, so that there's meaning in work, and so that the labor we offer to society produces in a way that human need is met daily? And we're not talking about a society of want and a society where we don't have. No, it's about actually harnessing and nurturing the highest creativity and productivity of everyone. And if we do that, there's enough creativity, production, technology, wealth for everybody, but also to protect the earth that's about to go down like the Titanic. Right? That's another problem with capitalism, that it does not care about its predation on nature.
It's just another resource, right?
It's just another resource. I mean, it's
cannibalistic. I mean, I think Marx thought it had a death urge, too, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's predatory, it's exploitative, it's just wants, it's driven by money and profit.
Yeah.
That's the driving force. I mean, that's just can't be good. Regardless of what you think, whether you think that capitalism is good or bad, just take a step back and think about a drive for profit that is blind and willing to take anything in front of you for that end.
Absolutely.
I mean, part of what you're saying is that that's a highly immoral system. Yeah. There are no ethics principles in that. That's lowest common denominator. We're going to war against the individual and the earth to gain profit
at the same time.
At the same time. I mean, it doesn't make sense. I mean, I think I constantly ask Christians, so is capitalism Christian? Like, help me see how it's Christian, given the message of Jesus, I didn't hear him say, it's easier to get Bill Gates through the eye of a needle, kind of thing. Right.
So.
Well, one of the fascinating things about the Young Lords is that they were all raised Catholic or in some Christian church. Some of them were Pentecostals and Protestants. And they used the power of religion and the Bible and its ethics to expose the contradictions of capitalism. They actually took over a church in East Harlem because the church was not meeting the needs of the community. And they quoted the Bible.
Yeah. I love that part. They re-Christianized the church.
They re-Christianized it. They called it, they re-Christianed it the People's Church.
Yeah. It was the first Spanish Methodist.
The first Spanish United Methodist Church.
I love the idea of re-Christianing churches.
Listen, but okay, I don't know if you've gotten to that chapter.
Yeah.
That was perhaps one of the hardest chapters for me to write. I mean, it's probably one of the best chapters. It forced me to dig deep into this question of ethics, morality, and religion, and what religion parades as in this country. Because in the writing of this history, I learned that the Methodists were hired by the government to educate Native Americans in these horrific Indian schools.
Yeah, boarding schools.
Think about how insane that is in terms of turning reality on its head.
Yeah.
The people who are supposed to be moral, connected to God, are in fact in the United States the people who managed the stripping of just the evisceration of culture, language, and the way of life of Native Americans in these schools that abused Native Americans and killed many of them. Children. I mean, it's...
Well, you know, many of the lynchings here, the folks were taken to churches to, you know, carry out. You know, I'm not, I mean, I'm pushing 60, and I was taught in Sunday school that Black people had been cursed by God. I was taught that the Pope was the Antichrist, not to mention the gendered stuff, you know.
So in other words, you're telling me that Marx's statement, religion is the opiate of the mass, was not off the mark, especially when studying American history.
Yeah. Well, you know, I don't know if you've read any Chris Hedges stuff like Christian fascism, right?
Right, Christian fascism, of course.
Yeah, you know, and I think what we have now is almost I mean, that's kind of what we're seeing in the last few weeks, right? Not folks that claim kind of a Christian identity, you know, but yeah. So what, in terms of the movements today, do you think, how are you feeling about them?
Okay,
like
so this is the other question. You asked like 4 of them simultaneously.
Yes, I do. That's why I'm cursed.
Right. So the question is, you know, what distinguishes a movement from protests? Historically, when movements emerge, there are multiple organizations,
right,
not one, that are putting forth different analyses of the problem and different solutions. And there isn't unanimity.
right.
Right. So in the 60s, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was led by Martin Luther King, but before long emerged SNCC, the Southern
Student Nonviolent
Coordinating Committee, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And a bunch of other organizations later emerge, including,
and we go down the list, right?
Yeah, I mean, and they have different analysis. They're working in separate places. They're connected to community. They're organizing, and there are protests on a mass scale that seek to bring people together. But ultimately, what you're talking about is a tradition of movement work and the transformation of society linked to local communities, and a consistent relationship to local communities that seeks to produce change, but also transform the consciousness and the values of those communities through engagement. Everywhere, right? So yeah, I mean, listen, the organizing tradition in this country has been dismembered by repression, by government repression.
Right.
The FBI and the counterintelligence program of the FBI literally dismembered, killed radicals in this country in the 60s.
Yeah.
Destroyed organizations.
Killed or imprisoned, right, too.
Imprisoned them.
Yeah.
So let me just say a few things, because we could blame the left, but in the 1930s, white workers mostly, in the main, built a union movement. And it's only white workers because black workers were excluded
Yeah, they
from
were
the union.
racist. Yeah. Yeah.
But white workers and their organizations had a battle over the strategy they needed to deploy to fight and win. And what emerges in the 1930s is a new labor fighting strategy that lets go of the picket line for the sit-down strike. There was a battle about that, a split in the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, the main union. People were like, yeah, whatever we were doing before is not working, and we've been doing it for almost 50 years. So what emerges is the sit-down strike, and the CIO, the new union, that's a faction within the labor movement. Those are the radicals. They argue that the labor movement has to organize in the major bastion of the American economy, the automobile industry. And that rather than leave the factory and walk the picket line, workers had to sit down in the factory and weld the factory shut when they went out on strike.
Right.
That's called the sit-down strike. I don't know if people in the South are aware of this history, but nobody knows this history. Nobody knows this history because we don't learn the history of labor struggles in this country.
Right.
So those labor struggles and that new strategy won. It won the unionization of the American working class, decent jobs with decent salaries, but also part of what the CIO and the labor movement argued was that we had to win the hearts and minds of America in the public square, and that American freedom had to be tied to economic equality. Estoy en una reunión, trabajo, deme un poco, necesito media hora. Está bien, entonces puede aquí, sí. Sorry.
It's okay.
So sorry about that.
It's okay. It's all
I don't know
right.
if you're gonna
We're just having a
answer this,
conversation.
But okay, so what ends up happening? Who built that movement? I mean, the unions, decent jobs, but also this notion that you had to win the hearts and minds of Americans and shift the narrative around American freedom and tie it to economic equality. It was socialists and communists who built the labor movement in the United States. And the backlash was McCarthyism,
Right.
in the 40s and 50s. But also the backlash was suburbanization.
Right.
Suburbanization, the dismembering of the cities and the transfer of white Americans from the city to the suburbs is a way of making people more conservative, committed to individual politics, and atomizing and isolating them, and tying them with a value organized around keeping up with the Joneses and getting cars and whatever it is that people.
It also guts the
Still
tax
homes
base
with.
of the city, right?
It also,
Guts the tax base of the city in terms of property taxes and so forth as folks flee.
Right. So yeah. So there's a tax base erosion in the city that happens as a result of suburbanization, which excludes people of color from home ownership. Right. And the government subsidizes white home ownership during this period. I mean, we talk a lot about affirmative action, but the biggest affirmative action in America was an economic one, and it was pretty much given to white Americans.
Right.
middle class and working class white Americans. So, so what I'm trying to say is that that was a very strategic way to destroy
Those
the
movements.
labor left.
Yeah.
The labor left in the 30s,
Yeah.
right? And in the 40s and the 50s. McCarthyism also essentially forced the unions to purge its radicals,
Right.
right? In the 1960s, when a new generation of radicals emerges, the way of repression is literally homicidal. Fred Hampton,
Right.
who's the leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, a brilliant young man who in fact is the leader of the Rainbow Coalition, a coalition that brings together poor whites from Appalachia, Black Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans together in a coalition on the basis of shared class interest. That guy who starts talking about the haves and the have-nots, who says that racism is a product of capitalism and the institution of slavery, and that we can't fight racism without fighting capitalism, he gets killed.
It's basically executed.
Executed.
Yeah.
Latin American style,
Right.
dictatorship style, in Chicago, in his sleep.
Right.
In a project designed by the Chicago Police Department and the FBI, the counterintelligence program of the FBI. And the Black Panthers are killed by the cops. I mean, and by the FBI. There's a homicidal campaign of repression launched by the American government to destroy the Black left and the brown left and
Yeah, I was
radical.
fixing to say the Chicano movement, Native American movement.
Chicano movement, Puerto Ricans.
Right.
Absolutely. So, so that's where we are. And it's going to take a minute for us to rebuild a militant, radical left tradition that seeks to amplify a different ethic, that seeks to amplify a critique of capitalism and an alternative to capitalism, and that seeks to be anchored in community, right? Because ultimately, that's what shifts the values of society, right? When you have activists, organizers in communities all over the country, engaging people in meaningful campaigns, you shift the consciousness at the grassroots.
Yeah. Well, I think it counters the
country.
alienation. It counters the alienation. It counters atomization.
Right.
You know.
And it offers people a sense that
purpose.
Yeah, that together.
Yeah.
We can rebuild society anew. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement has definitely shifted consciousness in a massive way.
Yeah.
The reason why we're talking about defunding the police and police violence is because of the Black Lives Matter movement, but mostly because people rioted in Ferguson and Minneapolis.
Right.
And I'll just say that the riot is the only language Americans listen to when it comes to police violence or the suffering of Black people.
Yeah, we've encountered that with the whole statue issue, that we approached the state 8 years ago, provided all the data, approached the governor, approached the legislature, was totally ignored. You know, it's a funny thing, right? The lawmakers won't do the moral thing, right? But then when people are exacerbated and start yanking things down again, people get criminalized as vandals when you had the opportunity 10 years ago to address this. You had all the data in front of you. So just shut the fuck up, you know? it's a mess. You know, it's kind of how it works.
So, this is a new world in which we live. Technology has both propelled the movements forward, but it also has the capacity to keep people in silos and to confuse social media work with organizing.
Yeah, amen.
And a new generation of activists are in the process, and organizers of figuring this out. And part of what sociologists and people who study history and social movements know is that it's also not about individual will and organizing alone. The system itself produces structural crisis that then propels individuals alone and in their collectives to devise strategies to push this project of human liberation forward. But we could also use some lessons from the past, so that we're not like relearning some basic history. Like, for example, that workers have an enormous amount of power. If they organize collectively and withdraw their power from the point of production. So in New York, 1,400 workers went out on strike. These are people who work in a produce market, who provide the produce for businesses and supermarkets all over New York City. They provide 60% of the produce in the city. 1,400 of them went out on strike. That's how big the workforce is. And they were only asking for $1 an hour a raise. They went out on strike for a week. They wanted $3 over the course of 3 years. They got $1.85, but they were able to stop the employer from forcing them to contribute to the healthcare benefit. And now the employer is paying 40 cents an hour toward their healthcare benefits. How else would you win something like this other than through deploying the power of labor? And if other workers in the city would have gone out on strike in solidarity with them, they would have gotten $3 and more.
Right. Yeah.
Because capitalism depends on the labor of workers for its profits. So, I mean, that's one of the lessons we got to learn. That we need strategy in the struggle to transform society.
We've been at this a little while, so I should probably let you go. But do you have anything that you want to say or add to this? I got a zillion other questions, so I hope we get to talk some more. You had made this comment in the book that the 1960s kind of civilized America, and I agree with that in so many ways, but I don't think people think of the 60s as civilizing, at least here.
So in many ways, this is a new Reconstruction moment because there's the need to civilize America. I mean, the 60s transformed the relationship between Black people and white people in the United States. It made rape unconscionable and unacceptable in the United States.
Instead of natural.
Through the women's movement, instead of natural. It amplified the oppression of other people of color beyond Black Americans, of Puerto Ricans and their relationship to the nation as colonized citizens, if you will. It raised the issue of Native American genocide. and the struggles of Native Americans to the land and to their homeland. It humanized the LGBTQ community and even raised the issue of transgender folks. This is all, I mean, I know that all these things for people in the South who are tied to Christian movements and churches, this is all breaking, all these subjects break all of the commandments, right? But if you think about that photograph of the sanitation workers in Memphis that Martin Luther King went to visit the week that he was killed, the posters that they were holding said, "I am a man."
Yeah.
What the movements did and are doing now is that they humanized the oppressed, the previously demonized and dehumanized. And also they establish rules and parameters. No, you will not lynch us.
Right.
And we will fight back and we will shoot back.
Yeah.
In the face of white supremacist violence against our person, our families, and our communities. The reason why the Black Panthers are so hated, even though if you look at what the Black Panthers did, they're responsible for mainstreaming breakfast to poor children across the country. That's what they started out doing. But they also, using the law and the Second Amendment, decided that they were going to police the police in Oakland, that they were going to follow the police around armed with exposed arms, which was legal, and carrying the Constitution to make sure that cops weren't killing people in Oakland.
Right.
But when Black people start arming themselves against white supremacy and police violence,
We change the rules.
That's taboo. That's getting to the core of the power of resistance and the roots of white supremacy, Black oppression and exploitation in this country. So they broke all the commandments clearly, and they were targets of the state. But in doing so, they asserted their place in this country unequivocally and inspired Black people to stand up and fight and be proud of being Black. And they had a critique of capitalism, the Black Panthers. So the movement civilized America. It returned to Black people, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Native Americans, Asians, a sense of their own humanity and agency. It hit the bully in the nose. No, you can't govern my life. You can't lynch me. And if you do, I'm going to fight back. And these massive struggles that were multi-ethnic and multiracial transformed the consciousness of the nation and just made it unacceptable to be a white supremacist in public. It shifted the standards, morals, and values of American society. It's a complicated movement that had leaders like Martin Luther King and organizers like Ella Baker and Fred Hampton, but also
Fannie Lou Hamer. I would go down the list.
But also kids like Cha-Cha Jimenez, who was very young, and Denise Oliver and Felipe Luciano and Juan Gonzalez. These are members of the Young Lords organizing in New York and Chicago, who were taking back their communities and dreaming of an America worth living in, a structurally more humane and equal America, not just for the racially oppressed, but for all.
Yeah.
The Black freedom struggle has historically expanded the experience of freedom for all Americans. Unfortunately, white Americans don't understand the ways in which the Black freedom struggle has expanded their own freedoms. But it's maybe a subject for a different podcast.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, Dr. Fernández, thank you so much for the time. I've got a zillion questions I wanted to ask you about the Chicano movement, and because the notion of Aztlán, right, is kind of a nationalistic, particularly in terms of the colonization of the Southwest. But we'll hopefully we'll talk again, because
let's have this conversation again. And just finally, I mean, I've been speaking in a way, I think, that has sought to speak to the unconverted, right? Or to people who are hostile to these ideas. When I said religion is the opiate of the mass, I mean, this is a phrase associated with Marx. But in many ways, if we objectively think about religion in the southern states and the ways in which religion contributes to a denial of reality, we see that this Marxist analysis that we poo-poo is actually right on. But the thing about religion is that you can't talk sense into it, or to folks who abide. It's an ideology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, but good luck. I think this project is important and phenomenal. I think your podcast title, Going South, is exactly
a lot of different things.
It's exactly what we need to do.
Yeah.
Because unless we're going to split up, we got to figure out a strategy for saving the nation in many ways.
Yeah. Amen.
From the left.
Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording, but again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.